When I bought my house in Evergreen Ridge, I thought I was getting a slice of peace. A modest, single-story home on the edge of the neighborhood, with a large backyard that backed into a wooded buffer zone. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. I had just retired from teaching high school history, and all I wanted was to spend my golden years tending my garden, building my koi pond, and enjoying a cold beer in a hammock. But, as I learned quickly, peace and quiet weren't exactly included in the purchase. Not when you had a homeowners association with too much power and a president who acted like a medieval queen ruling a kingdom of hedges and driveways. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. Karen Whitmore, to be exact. She had the perm of someone who hadn't updated their look since 1986, a clipboard that never left her side, and a voice sharp enough to slice cheese. She ran the Evergreen Ridge HOA with an iron fist wrapped in a floral oven mitt. I tried to stay under her radar. I trimmed my hedges, kept my mailbox polished, and even painted my fence the exact shade of warm sand listed in the Neighborhood Compliance Handbook. But no matter what I did, Karen always found a way to pop up, sometimes literally, like a nosy prairie dog with a grudge. It started with small things. One morning I found a notice taped to my door saying my garbage bins were visible from the street for more than 20 minutes. Another time she flagged my wind chimes for potential sound pollution. But the real storm began when I started building my backyard project. I'd been dreaming about it for years. A Japanese-style garden complete with a koi pond, rock path, and tiny tea pergola. I hired a contractor, pulled the proper permits from the county, I double-checked everything, and got started. 2 days into construction, Karen showed up, uninvited as always, walking into my backyard like she owned the place. "Mr. Lyle," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I don't remember seeing this project listed in the neighborhood improvement request forms." I set down the trowel I was using and wiped my hands on my jeans. "That's because I pulled permits directly from the county," I told her. "Since this area is technically outside the HOA's jurisdiction, I didn't need to file anything with you." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly regained her footing. "Well, even if that's true, the board reserves the right to intervene if a project affects the visual harmony of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean my backyard? The one no one can see from the street?" She crossed her arms, lips pursed. "Rules are rules. You'll be hearing from us." And I did. That week, I received a formal notice from the HOA board declaring my construction disruptive and non-compliant with community standards. They demanded I halt all work immediately. I responded with a polite letter and copies of my county permits. A week later, I got a new notice. This one was worse. The HOA had held an emergency vote and passed a resolution claiming my backyard qualified as unclaimed common ground due to historical boundary confusion. They were planning to repurpose it into a public mini-park for the enjoyment of all residents. I nearly dropped my coffee. They weren't just trying to stop my project. They were trying to take my land. I called the county office, furious. "There's no such thing as unclaimed common ground in a zoned residential backyard," the clerk assured me. "If your property line includes that space and it's on your deed, it's yours." And it was. My backyard, all 0.4 acres of it, was fully mine according to every official document. So why was the HOA acting like it was a community donation? I'll tell you why. Because Karen wanted to build her legacy. I later found out through a very chatty neighbor named Doris that Karen had been angling for a neighborhood beautification award from the regional HOA Federation. Yes, that's a real thing, apparently. She needed a big project to clinch it. And my unused backyard had become her golden ticket. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't going to roll over like the other residents. No, I had a plan. I didn't spend 30 years teaching teenagers how to see through manipulative tactics just to get bulldozed by a wannabe tyrant with a clipboard. I decided to fight fire with strategy. The first step? Play along. I didn't fight the notices. I didn't send another angry letter. I let them think they were winning. Within 2 weeks, HOA landscapers arrived with blueprints and poles. They began marking my property with little flags, measuring lines, and spray painting arrows on the grass. One of them was even bold enough to wave at me while laying out what I'm sure was going to be a bench area. I just smiled and waved back. "You okay with this?" Mark, my next-door neighbor, asked from over the fence. "For now," I said. He gave me a long look, but I just shrugged. "Trust me, Mark. Sometimes the best way to win is to let them dig their own hole first." He raised a beer in salute. "As long as you've got a plan, buddy." Oh, I had more than a plan. I had a trap. I spent the next few days cataloging everything. Every piece of playground equipment, every square foot of new sod, the benches, the fencing. They were all meticulously photographed and logged. Then I compiled a list of expenses based on average contractor costs. It wasn't cheap. Between the labor, materials, and landscaping, the HOA had dumped over $140,000 into what they called Oak Ridge Commons Park. And here's the kicker: they had no idea the land was still mine. I hadn't sold it. I hadn't transferred ownership. They just assumed, based on some outdated plat map, that they had the right. They didn't, and I was going to use that fact to crush them. My next step was visiting my lawyer, Abigail. She was sharp, efficient, and had a personal dislike for overreaching HOAs. As soon as I walked into her office and laid out the documents, she leaned back and raised an eyebrow. "They built an entire park on your property without permission?" she asked, disbelief thick in her voice. I nodded. "Playground, benches, a walking path, the works." She let out a low whistle and started flipping through the photos and deeds. "Do you want to file for damages or get the land back?" "Both," I said, my voice cold. "But I want to do it publicly. I want every single one of those board members humiliated." Abigail smiled slowly. "You came to the right place." We got to work immediately. First, she filed a cease and desist letter addressed directly to the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. It was polite, professional, and legally terrifying. It spelled out the fact that they had encroached on privately owned land, made alterations without consent, and would be held fully liable for any damages or costs incurred. She couriered the letter straight to the HOA president, Donna Billings. Within 24 hours, the entire HOA board was in panic mode. I wasn't there to witness the emergency meeting they called, but Mark, my neighbor and the ultimate gossip pipeline, filled me in. "They were freaking out," he whispered, eyes wide. "Donna was yelling about legal consequences, and Greg, the treasurer, looked like he was going to faint. Apparently, they never actually confirmed the land transfer. They just assumed." "Sounds about right," I said, sipping my coffee. "Any mention of backing down?" Mark grinned. "They were talking about trying to negotiate. Something about offering you park naming rights in exchange for not suing." I nearly spit out my drink. A few days later, I received a knock at the door. It was Donna herself, flanked by Greg and another board member, Susan. Donna wore a tight smile that barely hid the panic in her eyes. "Mr. Daniels," she began, hands clasped tightly in front of her, "we'd love to discuss a potential arrangement regarding the park." "You mean the park you built on my land?" I asked, stepping onto the porch with folded arms. "Yes, well, there was some miscommunication in the zoning office. It seems there was an assumption made." "An expensive one," I interrupted, "and illegal." Donna cleared her throat. "Look, we know this wasn't handled properly, but the park is already built. The community loves it. Children play there every day. It would be a shame to—" "Have it all torn down?" I finished, raising an eyebrow. "You're right. That would be a shame, but not for me." Greg finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "We were hoping we could offer you something in return. Naming the park after you, covering your HOA fees, maybe even a small payout." I almost laughed. "You're offering me a few crumbs to forget the fact you've squatted on my land?" I stepped closer. "Let me be clear. I'm not interested in names or handouts. You have 72 hours to begin dismantling the park and vacate the property, or my lawyer files the lawsuit." Susan looked like she might cry. Donna's smile vanished entirely. "You'd really go through with it, even after everything we've done to improve the neighborhood?" I nodded. "Especially because of that. You didn't improve it. You stole it. And now you're going to pay for it." I turned and walked back inside, leaving them speechless on my porch. True to my word, Abigail filed the lawsuit that Monday morning. It was a full-scale property encroachment suit, citing damages for unauthorized development, emotional distress, and legal fees. The suit also included a demand for the complete removal of the park structures and full restoration of my land. We served them in person at the next HOA meeting. It was glorious. Abigail walked into the community clubhouse in a tailored black suit, dropped the envelope in front of Donna, and announced to the room, "You've been officially served." The fallout was instant. Word spread like wildfire. Some residents were outraged. How could the HOA screw up that badly? Others were amused. One guy even thanked me. "I never wanted that park anyway," he said. "Now my HOA dues might actually go to fixing potholes instead of monkey bars." Mark told me Donna was losing support by the hour. "Half the board wants her gone," he said. "Greg already resigned." "Good," I said. "They'll need all the spare time they can get for court appearances." As the case moved forward, my lawyer uncovered even more damning evidence. Turns out the board had ignored multiple warnings from their own legal counsel. One of the emails, which we subpoenaed, said in plain terms, "Do not proceed with development until ownership is confirmed." But Donna, in her arrogance, had written back, "The land is clearly unclaimed. Let's move forward. We can clean up paperwork later if needed." That single email became the dagger in their defense. Abigail printed it out, highlighted it in red, and slapped it on the judge's desk at our first hearing. "This," she said, "is the HOA knowingly violating property law." I spent the rest of the weekend formulating a plan. I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to expose the entire HOA and make them wish they'd never touched my land. I started by reviewing every document I had from the purchase of my house. Tucked away in my filing cabinet was the original property survey, stamped and notarized, showing exactly where my boundaries were. It clearly outlined the backyard as private property. No easements, no public access. The HOA had absolutely no right to do what they'd done. Still, that wouldn't be enough. I needed more than just proof. I needed a trap. Something big. Something that would leave them exposed in front of everyone. On Monday morning, I went down to the county records office and requested a complete file on the HOA's zoning permits, land usage documents, and council communications. The clerk, a kind older woman named Janice, raised an eyebrow when she saw the request. "Bit of a project you've got here," she said, handing me the first folder. "It's personal," I replied with a tight smile. They transformed my backyard into a playground without asking. Her face twisted with sympathy. "Oh, honey, you're not the first to complain about Ridgebend HOA." That was the first sign I was onto something. I spent hours digging through documents, and that's when I struck gold. The zoning permit they'd used to justify the park on my land had a glaring flaw. It referenced an adjacent property lot number, not mine. They had mistakenly, or deliberately, used the wrong parcel number when filing the permit. It wasn't even a typo. It was someone else's land altogether, and the county had approved it without cross-checking. I nearly jumped out of my chair. This was it. This was the hole in their armor. Still, I needed to get eyes on it, quietly. So I reached out to my buddy Greg, a local real estate attorney who owed me a favor. He came by that evening, beer in hand, and listened to my story with growing disbelief. "Wait," he said, after I showed him the documents. "They used someone else's lot number and built a park on your land?" "Exactly," I said. "Is that enough for a lawsuit?" Greg leaned back and let out a low whistle. "That's more than enough. That's a legal seizure. That's negligence by the county. And if the HOA knew what they were doing, that's fraud." That night, we mapped out a legal strategy. Step 1 would be gathering more evidence, emails, messages, anything showing the HOA knew the permit was bogus. Step 2 would be hitting them with a formal cease and desist, backed by Greg's law firm. Step 3, expose them publicly, take them to court, and reclaim my property. But I wasn't content with just suing them. No, I wanted to dismantle the smug little empire they'd built, especially Karen. Karen, the queen of the HOA, hadn't wasted a second enjoying her new park. She held meetings right in the middle of my yard now, as if it were her personal conference room. On Wednesday, I watched from my porch as she led a group of board members through the garden, clipboard in hand. "We'll put in a gazebo over there," she said, pointing, "and maybe some benches under that tree." She laughed, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing 5 feet away, arms crossed, recording the entire thing on my phone. "Smile for the camera, Karen," I muttered. "You're going to be famous." But I didn't stop there. That weekend, I invited the local news to my house. Not the big outlets, just a few community reporters who were always looking for a juicy local scandal. One of them, a young guy named Trevor, was particularly excited. "Wait, they did what?" he said, staring at the documents I laid out on my table. "They built a public park on your land? With someone else's permit?" "Yep," I replied, "and they're using HOA funds to maintain it." Trevor's eyes gleamed. "This is going to get a lot of clicks." We filmed the interview right on my back porch with the new park in full view. Karen must have spotted the camera crew because she stormed out of her house mid-shoot. "What's going on here?" she demanded, marching over. "You can't film here without HOA permission." I didn't even look at her. "It's private property, remember?" I said. "That's what this whole thing is about." Trevor smiled politely. "Ma'am, do you have any comment about the HOA allegedly using an invalid permit to construct a park on someone's private property?" Karen's jaw dropped. That's ridiculous," she sputtered. "The park was legally approved. We followed every rule." I handed her a copy of the zoning map with the real lot number circled in red. "You mean that lot? Because that's not mine. You built on the wrong one." Karen's face went white. She opened her mouth to argue, but the camera was still rolling. She turned and stormed off without another word. And just like that, the footage was golden. That night, the story went live on the community news site. The headline read, "Local HOA builds park on private property. Owner fights back." The video racked up views fast. Comments flooded in from other Ridgebend residents, most of them furious. Apparently, I wasn't the only one they had screwed over. Someone else claimed the HOA had repaved their driveway without permission and billed them for it. Another said they were fined for hanging wind chimes. My inbox exploded. The next morning, I received a message from a county official requesting a meeting. Apparently, my little expose had stirred up some serious questions about zoning compliance. I walked into the county office with a stack of documents, videos, and witness statements. The official, a straight-laced woman named Ms. Hillman, took one look at the permit and frowned. "This is not good," she muttered. "This parcel number's from the lot 2 streets over. How did this get approved?" I just shrugged. "Maybe ask Karen." Ms. Hillman assured me they would launch an internal review immediately. Meanwhile, Greg was drafting the cease and desist, and my backyard was crawling with nosy reporters and neighbors. Karen had officially gone radio silent. No HOA memos, no sidewalk confrontations. It was almost too quiet, which only made me more suspicious. Greg called me later that day with an update. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Karen filed a counterclaim with the county. She's trying to declare the land community property based on historic use." I nearly dropped the phone. "She's what?" Greg laughed. "It won't hold. Not a chance, but it means she's panicking. We've got her cornered." I walked out to my porch and looked over the park that used to be my yard. Kids were playing on the swings, someone was flying a kite, and a couple was walking their dog through the middle of my garden. It should have made me furious, but instead I felt something else. Determination. Because the deeper I dug into the HOA's mistakes, the more I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone they'd wronged. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of strategic mischief. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was focused. While the HOA proudly held events on my stolen land, I kept quiet, played nice, and took meticulous notes. I documented every unauthorized construction, every public event flyer, and every time one of their guests parked illegally or left trash behind. My favorite part? The fundraiser. The HOA hosted a massive picnic-style event one Saturday, complete with a bouncy castle, food trucks, and a live band. It was meant to celebrate our growing community and, ironically, raise funds for more park expansions. I stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, sipping lemonade, listening as Karen made a big speech about how we must all make sacrifices for the greater good. My blood boiled, but I smiled through it. "Oh, I'm sacrificing all right," I muttered to myself. "Just wait." Karen had no idea that every minute her guest spent on my land was being documented, time-stamped, photographed, and cataloged. She also had no idea I had hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one of the best in the county, someone who specialized in property rights. I met with him in secret and presented my case. "Let me get this straight," he said, raising an eyebrow. "They rezoned your backyard into public land without your consent, built park amenities on it, and then started using it for HOA events." I nodded. "And you've got documentation of it all?" I slid over a thumb drive and a thick folder. He skimmed a few pages and smiled. "You've got yourself a slam-dunk lawsuit." That was music to my ears. The hardest part was keeping calm as they kept doubling down. Karen added a gazebo right in front of what used to be my deck, and she had the audacity to call it a scenic retreat for the neighborhood. My scenic retreat. I watched workers pour concrete and drive in wooden posts while I cooked dinner in silence, the camera on my phone recording every movement. One afternoon, I even overheard a couple walking through the park area, saying how nice it was of the HOA to donate this space. I laughed bitterly. "Oh, I donated it, all right," I muttered, right after they stole it. But it was all going to pay off soon. The moment they started charging event vendors to set up on my land, it crossed from insult to income theft. My lawyer advised patience. "The more rope they give us, the harder they hang themselves," he said. "Let them keep building. Let them keep using it. Every dollar they collect is another nail in their legal coffin." So I waited. I watched Karen organize yoga sessions on Tuesday mornings. I waved at her as she barked orders at city workers trimming her hedges. She smirked and waved back, smug as ever. But I had something she didn't, a strategy, and my plan was about to hit the ignition. One night I met with my lawyer and a private investigator in a little diner off Main Street. The investigator had traced the rezoning process and discovered something huge. "There was a hearing," he said, flipping open his notebook, "but you weren't notified. At all. The HOA petitioned the zoning board, but they used an old mailing address for you, one that hasn't been valid in 2 years. The notices bounced back, but they went ahead anyway." My lawyer nodded. "That's illegal. They failed due process. That means this whole rezoning is voidable." I grinned. "So, we can sue?" "Not just sue," my lawyer said. "We can nuke them." The plan was now official. We would file a lawsuit, not just against the HOA, but against Karen personally for abuse of power and the city zoning board for negligence. I went home that night, my chest buzzing with energy. It was time to stop playing defense. I wasn't going to wait for justice. I was going to deliver it myself. But before I launched the legal missile, I had one more move to make. I reached out to a local journalist I knew from a few years back. She owed me a favor, and I cashed it in. "You want to leak a story?" she asked. "About a homeowners association stealing private land and using it as public property without consent?" "Exactly," I said. "With photos, legal documents, everything." She laughed. "Oh, this is going to make a hell of a Sunday headline." 3 days later, Oak Ridge woke up to a headline splashed across the local news site. Private property seized by HOA. Resident prepares legal bombshell. Karen's face was in the article, along with photos of her ribbon-cutting events, vendor booths, and the scenic gazebo. The article quoted anonymous sources, detailed the illegal rezoning, and hinted at massive lawsuits to come. By noon, it was the talk of the town. HOA members began emailing, calling, and texting each other in panic. I sipped coffee on my porch and watched the chaos unfold. Karen showed up at my door, red-faced and trembling with rage. "You leaked that story," she hissed. "You're trying to destroy the community." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm trying to take back what's mine. You made this personal the moment you built a park on my lawn." She jabbed a finger toward me. "You're going to regret this." I stepped forward, my voice calm and measured. "Karen, I've regretted nothing. But you? You're going to regret not knocking on my door and asking permission before turning my backyard into your own empire." She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. But I didn't care anymore. The fuse was lit. The fireworks were coming. The lawsuit hit like a wrecking ball. I served the HOA, the city zoning department, and Karen personally with a formal 46-page complaint, detailing every legal violation they had committed in transforming my backyard into a public park. The claim included illegal rezoning without due process, trespassing, unlawful construction on private property, theft of revenue generated from events, and emotional distress. My lawyer was brilliant. He included photographic evidence, zoning records, and even the bounced mail Karen had used to pretend I was unreachable. As soon as the paperwork landed in their hands, the entire HOA board exploded into panic. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, like someone admiring a fire they'd set in the fireplace. Karen tried to rally the troops, calling for an emergency meeting, but by then the HOA was fractured. Some members realized they had been dragged into a lawsuit without ever knowing the full story. Others were furious at her for making them complicit. That same week, the journalist who broke the story published a follow-up. This one included statements from other residents who had felt bullied by Karen's leadership, including stories of unauthorized fines, ignored maintenance requests, and sudden rule changes. The HOA's pristine image began to crack. Neighbors who had once bought into the Karen Knows Best act started whispering behind her back. Some even reached out to me in private, offering apologies and asking if they'd be named in the lawsuit. "Not unless you were part of the land grab," I said. "I'm only going after the people who actively helped make it happen." One woman, Meredith, nearly cried. "I voted for the park idea. I didn't know it was your land. I thought it was public." I nodded. That's exactly how they wanted it to seem. Karen, of course, went on the defensive immediately. She tried to paint me as the villain. At the next HOA meeting, which was moved to Zoom after the clubhouse was egged by a few very passionate neighbors, Karen gave a speech dripping with fake concern. "This individual," she said, referring to me without ever saying my name, "has chosen to divide our community. He's suing not just me, but all of you. Because of one backyard. One." But someone finally stood up. An older man named Jim, who'd lived on the street longer than anyone, raised his hand and cut her off. "No, Karen," he said firmly. "He's suing you because you stole his land and acted like it belonged to you. That ain't community, that's tyranny." The Zoom chat blew up with messages of support. Karen's grip on the HOA was slipping. Meanwhile, my lawyer had filed a motion to request a temporary restraining order. The goal? Shut down the park immediately until ownership was resolved in court. Within a week, the order was granted. City workers showed up to put up caution tape around the entire area. "Closed due to legal dispute," the signs read. Karen was livid. She ran out into the middle of the taped-off zone, barking at the workers like a cornered dog. "This is a public space," she screamed. One of the men calmly replied, "Not according to the county judge, ma'am. This is private property pending litigation." I watched from my window with a hot mug of tea, enjoying the sight of her being ushered away from my land for the first time in months. The fallout only grew from there. With the park shut down, the HOA had to cancel all upcoming events. That meant refunding deposits, answering angry emails, and dealing with vendors demanding explanations. Every bit of chaos pulled more of the neighborhood's trust away from Karen and the board she had manipulated. Eventually, the city sent an official investigator to examine the zoning department's handling of the situation. That's when the real gold mine was uncovered. A whistleblower stepped forward, an anonymous employee from the zoning office, claiming that Karen had personally pressured staff to push the rezoning through without verifying the notice process. The story went public in a third article, and suddenly it wasn't just a civil issue anymore. The county opened a formal investigation into misuse of office and possible fraud. Karen's once unshakable position became a sinking ship. People she had leaned on for years suddenly wouldn't return her calls. The HOA's lawyer quit, citing a conflict of interest. Their insurance provider dropped them. Residents started talking openly about dissolving the HOA altogether. A petition circulated, and within a few days, more than half the community had signed it. Karen responded by going full scorched earth. She posted long rants on the community Facebook group about how she had sacrificed everything to beautify the neighborhood and how ungrateful everyone was for turning on her. But no one took the bait. They'd seen too much, and no amount of spin could undo the reality of what she'd done. As the case progressed, we moved into discovery. My lawyer demanded access to HOA emails, internal documents, and communications with the zoning board. What we found was damning. Karen had not only hidden the rezoning process from the community, but she had also used HOA funds to pay for the construction on my property, without a formal vote. One email even included the phrase, "He'll never fight back. By the time he realizes, we'll already have the playground up." That sentence alone became the centerpiece of our case. When my lawyer showed it to me, I nearly laughed. "They really thought I was some pushover," I said. "She thought you'd roll over," he replied, "but now we've got the whole mountain coming down on her." It was nearly time for the court date. The HOA board tried to negotiate, but the settlement they offered was pathetic. "We'll remove the structures and return the land to you if you drop the suit," they said. "Oh, no," I replied. "You don't just give someone their stolen property back and call it even. We're going the distance." My lawyer smiled and nodded. "They've had plenty of chances to fix this. Now we hold them accountable." The courtroom was packed on the day the trial began. Local media had picked up the story by now, and reporters filled the benches, murmuring quietly as I walked in with my lawyer. Karen was already seated at the defendant's table, her face pale and tight-lipped, flanked by two attorneys who looked like they were regretting ever taking her case. The HOA board members sat behind her, most of them keeping their eyes down, avoiding the stares from the audience. I glanced toward the gallery and saw several neighbors who had once sided with the HOA now watching with crossed arms and grim expressions. It wasn't just my land they were here to support, it was the principle. This wasn't just a case about a backyard, it was about a community held hostage by one woman's power trip. Opening statements began, and my lawyer, a seasoned trial expert named Daniels, didn't hold back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing in front of the jury, "imagine coming home one day to find your backyard, your private, legally owned backyard, turned into a public park. Imagine watching strangers walk through it, picnic in it, even organize yoga classes on your lawn. All of it approved by a homeowners association without your consent, without your knowledge, and in violation of every zoning and property law we have. That is what happened to my client, and today we will prove that this was not a mistake. It was a deliberate abuse of power." Karen's lawyer stood and tried to present it as a misunderstanding, claiming that public good had been the goal and that the HOA had acted in the community's best interest. But that defense crumbled the moment Daniels presented the email with Karen's incriminating words. The judge raised an eyebrow as Daniels read aloud, He'll never fight back. By the time he realizes, we'll already have the playground up. He paused to let it sink in. That is not an accident. That is not oversight. That is intent. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and I noticed a few beads of sweat on her forehead. We continued to lay out the case over the next 2 days. I testified, describing the moment I returned home from vacation to find a construction crew pouring cement on my grass. Daniels introduced photos, receipts showing the HOA's use of communal funds for personal legal battles, and testimony from neighbors who admitted they were misled. One elderly woman confessed that Karen told her, "We already got permission," when she voted to approve the project. Then came the bombshell. The whistleblower from the zoning office was subpoenaed and took the stand. He calmly explained how Karen had called his supervisor and insisted that notices not be sent to my mailing address, claiming I had vacated the property. He even brought an internal memo that read, "Expedite Ridgeway property rezoning, per HOA leadership request. Priority level, urgent." The courtroom gasped. Karen's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it. "You're telling this court," the judge asked, "that HOA members used personal influence to override notice requirements?" The man nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor, and I deeply regret that I didn't speak up sooner." Karen's face was stone. Her lawyers asked for a recess. When court resumed, they tried to settle, again. This time they offered compensation for damages and a public apology. But Daniels leaned toward me and whispered, "They're panicking. We can go for the throat." I nodded. "No deals," I said. "Let the jury hear everything." And they did. They heard how the HOA had ignored my deed, how they built without permits, how they collected park event fees and never reported them, and how Karen used HOA dues to buy herself a new garden fence and patio furniture, all under the guise of community beautification. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Closing arguments were fiery. Daniels looked each juror in the eye and said, "This could happen to any one of you. If this woman gets away with this, if this HOA is allowed to violate private property and silence dissent, then none of us are safe in our own homes. The law must be respected, property must be protected, and justice must be served." Karen's lawyer stumbled through a weak rebuttal, claiming my absence during vacation meant I had abandoned the land temporarily and thus didn't exercise property rights. But it was too late. The damage was done. The jury didn't even take a full day to deliberate. When the verdict was read, I held my breath. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreperson said. "The defendant, Ridgeway HOA and Karen Morton, are liable for unlawful seizure of property, misuse of HOA funds, trespass, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The judge nodded and leaned forward. "And given the nature of this case, I'm awarding punitive damages in the amount of $500,000. Karen let out a quiet gasp. Her lawyers' mouths dropped. I closed my eyes and exhaled for the first time in months. We had won, but the judge wasn't done. "In addition," he said, turning toward Karen, "this court recommends that the HOA be dissolved pending a full financial audit. Any remaining funds shall be used to compensate the community members affected by the misuse of funds. Mrs. Morton, you are hereby barred from holding any HOA leadership role in this county for the next 10 years. The room erupted. Reporters stood to rush out and publish the breaking news. Neighbors clapped. And Karen? She slumped in her chair like a marionette whose strings had just been cut. Outside the courthouse, Daniels clapped me on the back. "That," he said, "was one for the books." My phone buzzed with texts. Neighbors congratulating me, people thanking me for standing up to her, even a few strangers sending digital high fives. The fallout from the case was immediate. Karen tried to appeal, but the evidence was so overwhelming that no lawyer in town would take her case without a massive retainer. The HOA board resigned in disgrace, and a temporary committee was formed to restructure neighborhood leadership, this time with community input and transparency. I had my land back, but more importantly, I had made sure no one would ever try to steal it again. With the trial behind me and Karen's empire crumbling like a poorly built pergola, I finally had room to breathe. But my battle wasn't just about retribution, it was about restoration. I didn't want my backyard to go back to the way it was before. I wanted to reclaim it with purpose. So, the first thing I did was host a neighborhood meeting. Not under some shady HOA umbrella, but out in the open, with coffee, lawn chairs, and an open invite to every single resident in the subdivision. No voting required. No fines if you showed up 5 minutes late. Just people, community, and a shared desire to heal from Karen's reign. As neighbors trickled in, there was a nervous energy in the air. A few folks still clung to the old way of things, wondering what kind of control I might be looking to grab now that the HOA was gone. But once I stood up and welcomed everyone, thanked them for their support, acknowledged the hurt and division the HOA had caused, and promised that I wasn't trying to replace it with another dictatorship, the tension eased. "I want this place to be ours again," I said, gesturing to the newly reclaimed land behind my fence. "Let's turn this space into something for everyone, not because someone's making you, but because we actually want it." The first vote was simple: no more HOA. Ever. We agreed to form a voluntary neighborhood coalition, completely optional, where ideas could be shared and improvements coordinated through trust, not threats. That very night, folks began pitching in. We pulled up the remnants of the playground Karen had illegally installed and replaced it with picnic tables, benches, and native plants. Someone donated string lights. Another neighbor, a retired carpenter, offered to build a community library box. It was wild how quickly things turned around when fear wasn't involved. My backyard, once ground zero in a war for control, was now a symbol of what neighborhood living should have been all along. Of course, Karen didn't disappear without a trace. A few weeks after the trial, I saw a moving van outside her house. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, barking into a phone, while a couple of weary-looking movers shuffled her belongings into the truck. I couldn't hear every word, but phrases like, "I'm not staying in this joke of a town," and "they turned against me like traitors," floated across the street. I stayed quiet, just watching from my porch. There was no victory lap to be had. She had lost everything: her title, her influence, and soon, even her address. As the truck pulled away and she slammed her door for the final time, a cheer quietly broke out across the cul-de-sac. Life post-Karen wasn't just peaceful. It was better than ever. Freed from pointless restrictions, people began painting their homes in cheerful colors, planting flowers that had once been deemed non-compliant, and starting projects that would have earned them fines just a few months earlier. One neighbor installed a wind chime sculpture in his front yard. Another turned her side lawn into a community herb garden. I expanded my own backyard sanctuary, adding a koi pond and a small greenhouse. It was therapeutic, not just for me, but for the whole block. Then came the icing on the cake. About 3 months after the trial, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from the county's Office of Civil Accountability. I opened it cautiously, unsure what else could possibly surprise me after everything we'd been through. Inside was a formal commendation, acknowledging my legal victory against the HOA, the restoration of community property rights, and the impact it had on statewide discussions about HOA reform. There was even a mention that my case had inspired new proposed legislation aimed at curbing abusive HOA overreach. I stood there in my kitchen, reading that letter over and over, stunned by what we'd accomplished. And we weren't done yet. That summer, we held our first annual Park Freedom Festival. A tongue-in-cheek name, but everyone loved it. We brought in food trucks, had a live band play under the stars, and even set up a bounce house for the kids. People danced on the very spot where Karen had once stood screaming at a dad for letting his toddler draw with chalk on the sidewalk. We lit fireworks, raised glasses, and toasted not just to the end of a corrupt HOA, but to the beginning of something better. I'll admit, every now and then I catch myself looking at the spot where the HOA's old community rules sign once stood. It had been full of nonsense about mailbox colors and lawn gnome height restrictions. Now, in its place, is a hand-carved wooden sign that reads, "You are welcome here." And under it, in smaller letters, "No fines, no power trips, just neighbors." Karen had tried to turn my backyard into her legacy, but in the end, all she did was pave the way for something far more meaningful. The park she built on stolen land? Gone. But the real park, our park, was thriving. And it wasn't because someone told us to make it happen. It was because we wanted to. That's the thing about community. You can't legislate it. You can't threaten it into existence. It has to be earned, nurtured, and protected from those who think authority makes them better than everyone else. Karen didn't understand that. But the rest of us, we figured it out. And now we had the kind of neighborhood that didn't need a rule book to function. We had trust. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if Karen ever realized the magnitude of her mistake. Probably not. But I do know this. She thought she was turning my yard into her monument of control. Instead, she built the stage for her own downfall, and for the rebirth of a community that had almost forgotten how to smile. And now, every time I sit by the koi pond, a book in one hand and a coffee in the other, I can hear laughter in the distance, kids playing, neighbors chatting, no clipboards, no citations, just peace, real peace. And that, to me, is the greatest revenge of all.